In the space between sleeping and waking, where consciousness softly dissolves into the realm of infinite possibility, there exists a sanctuary of stories narratives that carry the power to transform, to heal, to illuminate the deepest corners of the human experience. Tonight, as your body begins its natural descent into rest, your mind opens to receive a tale that will journey through the labyrinth of kindness, exploring the delicate balance between generosity and self-preservation, between giving and receiving, between love for others and love for oneself. In this sacred space of narrative, we meet someone whose heart beats with the rhythm of perpetual giving, whose spirit flows like a river that never asks for rain, whose existence has become a masterpiece of accommodation painted in shades of everyone else's needs. This soul, like perhaps your own, has learned to measure worth through the satisfaction of others, to find identity in the act of perpetual service, to discover meaning in the endless cycle of meeting expectations that stretch far beyond boundaries of healthy relationship. Through the portal of imagination, we witness the beautiful tragedy of the overgiver, the one who has forgotten that the heart must also receive what it gives, that the well of compassion must be refilled to continue flowing, that the candle of kindness burns brightest when it is not consumed by its own flame. In this realm, where healing happens through story, we explore the psychology of being too nice, not as a flaw to be corrected, but as a profound expression of human love that has simply lost its way, forgotten its own address, become orphaned. From the very heart that seeks to serve. As your breathing naturally deepens and your muscles begin to release the tensions of the day, allow yourself to drift into this narrative landscape where transformation becomes possible, where the patterns that have governed your relationships can be seen with new eyes, where the stories you tell yourself about who you must be to be worthy of love can be gently rewritten. Here, in the quantum field of possibility, consciousness expands to embrace both the beauty of your generous spirit and the necessity of your own well-being. The journey ahead unfolds in the timeless space of the soul, where linear progression gives way to spiral understanding, where healing happens not through force, but through the gentle recognition of truth. In this dimension of story, we discover that being too nice is not a simple matter of weak boundaries or people-pleasing, but a complex constellation of love, fear, conditioning, and the deep human longing to belong, to matter, to be worthy of the care we so freely give to others. Tonight, as sleep approaches on silent wings, you are invited to witness this transformation not as a distant observer, but as a participant in the universal human experience of learning to love others without losing oneself, to give without depleting, to care without becoming lost in the caring. The story that unfolds carries within its DNA the blueprint for your own healing, the recognition that your kindness is not your weakness, but your strength seeking balance, your love seeking wisdom, your heart seeking wholeness. In the gentle hills of a valley where morning mist dances with golden sunlight, there lived a woman named Elena, whose hands seemed to hold the gift of healing and whose presence brought peace to every room she entered. At 34, Elena had built a life that looked beautiful from the outside, a successful practice as a massage therapist, a cottage surrounded by gardens she tended with the same care she offered her clients, and a circle of friends who knew they could always count on her wisdom, her listening ear, her willingness to drop everything when they needed support. Yet beneath this carefully cultivated exterior, Elena carried a weight that had grown heavier with each passing year, the exhaustion of a soul that had forgotten how to receive, the loneliness of a heart that gave so much it had little left for itself, the quiet desperation of someone who had become so skilled at meeting others' needs that she had lost touch with her own. Her days began before dawn, not with self-care rituals or gentle morning practices, but with mental lists of everyone she needed to check on, every obligation she had promised to fulfill, every way she could make others' lives easier. Elena's Childhood had been a masterclass in hypervigilance disguised as compassion. Raised by a mother whose anxiety filled their home like storm clouds, and a father whose anger could erupt without warning, she had learned early that her safety depended on her ability to read the emotional weather of those around her, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to smooth over conflicts before they could fully form. Her nervous system had been trained to scan for signs of distress in others, to prioritize their comfort above her own. To find security in the act of caregiving, it seemed to bring temporary calm to the chaos of her early world. This adaptive strategy had served her well in childhood, earning her the praise of adults who marveled at her maturity, her thoughtfulness, her uncanny ability to know exactly what someone needed before they asked. But somewhere in the transition from surviving childhood to living as an adult, the protective mechanism had become a prison. The survival strategy had become an identity, and the little girl who had learned to be nice to stay safe had grown into a woman who no longer knew how to be anything else. Alana's relationships followed predictable patterns. She attracted people who needed healing, who required emotional support, who seemed to instinctively recognize her as someone who would give without asking for reciprocity. Her romantic partnerships inevitably became caretaking relationships, where she provided emotional stability while receiving fragments of attention in return. Her friendships were built around her availability rather than mutual interest. Her professional life was structured around other schedules rather than her own rhythms. And her family relationships maintained their equilibrium through her willingness to be the perpetual peacemaker. The irony was not lost on Elena that as a massage therapist, she spent her days helping others release tension and find peace in their bodies, while her own nervous system remained in a constant state of hyperactivation, scanning for the next person who might need her help, the next crisis that might require her intervention, the next opportunity to prove her worth through service. Her body held the stories of everyone she had ever helped, but she had forgotten how to listen to her own physical needs, how to honor her own rhythms, how to create space for her own healing dot in quiet moments. Those rare interludes when she wasn't actively helping someone, Elena would sometimes feel a deep longing rising from somewhere beneath her practiced smile. A yearning for connection that wasn't based on her usefulness, for love that didn't require her to be perpetually available, for relationships where she could be vulnerable without fear of abandonment. But these moments of awareness were quickly overshadowed by the familiar pull of someone else's need, the comfortable return to the role that had defined her for so long. Elena's cottage reflected her internal landscape, beautiful, welcoming, and meticulously arranged for others' comfort. The living room was set up for conversations where she could listen and offer support. The kitchen was always stocked with ingredients to make meals for friends going through difficult times, and her bedroom was the only space that felt purely hers, though even there she often found herself scrolling through messages from people who needed her attention, responding to requests for help that arrived at all hours of the day and night. The valley where Elena lived seemed to mirror her own generous spirit, abundant, nourishing, and giving life to everything that grew within its embrace. Yet even the most fertile valley needs the cycle of seasons, the rest of winter, the renewal of spring. Elena had been living in an eternal summer of giving, and her soul was beginning to yearn for the replenishment that comes only through receiving, the restoration that comes only through rest. The valley that cradled Elena's cottage was a place where the ancient wisdom of the earth seemed to pulse just beneath the surface, where the rhythm of seasons served as a constant reminder of the natural cycles of giving and receiving, expansion and contraction, growth and rest. Here, in this landscape that had witnessed countless generations of human experience, the very geography seemed to hold lessons about balance, about the way rivers must receive tributary waters to continue flowing, about the way trees must draw nutrients from the soil to offer shade and oxygen to the world. Elena's cottage sat at the intersection of several walking paths that had been worn smooth by centuries of footsteps trails that connected the various homes scattered throughout the valley, creating a network of community that relied on interdependence rather than isolated self-sufficiency. The cottage itself was built from local stone and timber, its walls holding the memory of the earth from which they came, its foundation rooted in soil that had been enriched by generations of careful tending. The gardens surrounding Elena's home were a testament to her understanding of nurturing herbs that offered healing, vegetables that provided nourishment, flowers that brought beauty and joy. But even in this carefully tended space, the natural world demonstrated principles that Elena had forgotten to apply to her own life. The roses that bloomed most brilliantly were those that had been pruned, their growth directed through selective cutting that allowed their energy to flow into the most beautiful expressions. The fruit trees that bore the sweetest harvest were those that had been allowed to rest in winter, their dormancy preparing them for the abundance of spring throughout the valley. Other residents lived their own versions of the human experience, each carrying their own stories of love and loss, growth and challenge, healing and wholeness. There was Marcus, the elderly man who had learned through decades of marriage that love sometimes meant saying no, that healthy boundaries created space for deeper intimacy rather than preventing it. There was Sarah, the young mother who had discovered that teaching her children to be self-sufficient was a greater gift than doing everything for them, that allowing them to struggle and succeed on their own built confidence that no amount of parental intervention could provide. The valley was also home to Kai, a therapist who had once struggled with the same patterns Elena faced, who had learned through his own journey that helping others required first helping himself, that the most powerful healing came not from endless availability, but from the deep well of self-compassion that allowed him to show up fully present when he chose to engage. His practice was built on the principle that sustainable caregiving required sustainable self-care, that the healer must be willing to receive healing to continue offering it. Authentically, in the center of the valley stood an ancient oak tree that had become a natural gathering place for the community. Its massive trunk spoke of centuries of growth, its deep roots drawing nourishment from far below the surface, its branches reaching wide to provide shelter and shade. The tree had survived storms that had felled younger trees, had weathered droughts that had challenged its very existence, had continued to grow and thrive through the simple wisdom of balance, taking what it needed from the earth and sun, giving what it could to the ecosystem around it, but never depleting itself in the process. The seasonal rhythms of the valley provided a constant teaching about the natural cycles of life. Spring brought the energy of new growth, when everything seemed to reach toward the light with unlimited enthusiasm. Summer offered the fullness of expression, when the valley burst with abundance and activity. Autumn provided the wisdom of letting go, when trees released their leaves to prepare for the dormancy ahead. And winter offered the gift of rest, when the life force withdrew inward to regenerate and prepare for the next cycle of growth. Yet, Elena had been living as if it were always spring, always time to give and grow and reach outward, never allowing herself the natural rhythms of receiving and resting that made sustained giving possible. Her nervous system had been locked in a perpetual state of summer alertness, scanning for needs to meet and problems to solve, never allowing itself the restorative cycles that even the most generous ecosystem required. The valley held other teachers. As well, the stream that meandered through the landscape, accepting water from mountain springs and rainfall, while simultaneously giving life to everything along its banks. The stream never seemed to struggle with this balance, never appeared to exhaust itself through giving, because it understood the fundamental truth that receiving and giving were part of the same continuous flow. When the stream encountered obstacles, it didn't force its way through, but found creative ways around them, carving new paths while maintaining its essential nature. At night, When Elena would sometimes walk the paths near her cottage, the valley would reveal its most profound teaching. In the darkness, when the busy activity of the day had settled into stillness, the true depth of the landscape became apparent. The stars overhead reflected the same patterns of light and shadow that played across the valley floor, creating a pastors. Overhead reflected the same patterns of light and shadow that played across the valley floor, creating a semisphere sense of connection between the intimate and the infinite, between the personal and the universal dot. It was in this sacred landscape that Elena's transformation would begin to unfold, supported by the wisdom of the earth beneath her feet and the base, infinite possibilities of the sky above her head. The valley had been waiting patiently for her to remember that she, too, was part of the natural world, subject to the same rhythms of giving and receiving, growth and rest, expansion and contraction that governed all life, here in this place, where the ancient patterns of healthy living were written in stone and stream, in tree and sky. Elena would begin to discover that her generous heart could learn to include herself in its circle of care, that her capacity for love could expand, to embrace her own needs with the same tenderness she offered to others, that her gift for healing could be turned inward to restore the balance that had been lost in years of one-sided giving. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Elena's bedroom window, casting dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of possibilities she had not yet imagined. As consciousness slowly returned from the depths of sleep, her body instinctively reached for the familiar armor of productivity, the comfortable weight of responsibility that had become so natural she rarely noticed its presence. Yet something in the quality of light this particular morning suggested that change was approaching, that the patterns which had governed her life for so long were beginning to stir, to shift, to prepare for transformation. The cottage around her held the accumulated energy of countless acts of service meals prepared for grieving friends, late-night conversations that had stretched until dawn, healing sessions that had extended far beyond their scheduled time because she couldn't bear to ask someone in pain to leave before they felt complete. Every corner of her home bore witness to her generous spirit, but also to the gradual erosion of boundaries that had left her feeling like a guest in her own life, not in the kitchen. The herbs she had dried from her garden hung in careful bundles, their healing properties waiting to be shared with whoever might need them. The refrigerator held containers of soup she had prepared for neighbors. The freezer stored backup meals for emergency situations that seemed to arise with increasing frequency among her circle of friends and family. Even her workspace was organized around others' needs, the massage table positioned to catch the most beautiful light for her clients, the essential oils selected more for their therapeutic value than for her personal preferences, the music playlist curated to create peace for others rather than to nourish her own soul. As Elena moved through her morning routine, the valley outside her windows began to stir with its own quiet activity. The stream that ran past her cottage continued its ancient conversation with the stones in its bed, neither rushing anxiously toward its destination nor holding back its natural flow. The birds that nested in the oak tree by her garden sang not because they felt obligated to provide beauty for others, but because song was their authentic expression, their natural gift to the world. The flowers in her garden opened to the sun not to please human observers, but because blooming was their essential nature, their way of participating in the larger conversation between earth and sky. Yet Elena had forgotten the difference between authentic expression and compulsive performance, between natural generosity and anxious accommodation. Her kindness had become entangled with her survival. Her love had become confused with her worth, and her gifts had become burdened with the weight of her own unmet needs. The valley held space for her remembering, for the gradual recognition that she, too, was part of the natural world, worthy of the same cycles of giving and receiving that governed all life. Standing at her kitchen window, watching the mist rise, from the valley floor as the sun gained strength. Elena felt a stirring she couldn't quite name, a whisper of longing for something she had lost. So long ago she could barely remember having it. It was the ghost of a feeling she had known as a very young child, before she had learned that love was something to be earned rather than received, before she had discovered that her value lay in her usefulness rather than her simple existence. The feeling lasted only a moment before being swept away by the familiar tide of morning obligations. But something in its brief presence suggested that this day would be different, that the patterns which had shaped her life were about to encounter something that would challenge their supremacy, question their necessity, and invite them to evolve into something more balanced, more sustainable, more aligned with the wisdom of her deepest self. Elena's days unfolded with the precision of a carefully choreographed dance, each movement calculated to minimize discomfort in others while maximizing her own sense of purpose. Her morning ritual began not with stillness or self-reflection, but with the immediate reach for her phone, scanning messages that had accumulated overnight, friends processing relationship difficulties, clients requesting last-minute appointment changes, family members sharing their latest concerns that somehow always required her immediate attention and advice. Before her feet touched the cottage floor, Elena's nervous system was already activated, her mind cataloging the emotional needs of others, her body preparing for another day of hypervigilance disguised as helpfulness. The coffee she brewed was always enough for two, anticipating the possibility that someone might stop by who needed warmth and conversation. The extra portions she prepared for meals were automatically packaged and delivered to neighbors she intuited might be struggling, though she rarely paused to consider whether her offerings were truly wanted or simply accepted out of politeness. Her professional practice had evolved into something far beyond the boundaries of traditional massage therapy. Clients arrived carrying not just physical tension, but emotional burdens they had learned to share with Elena, knowing she would listen without judgment, offer insights without charge, and hold space for their processing long after their scheduled appointments had ended. Her treatment room had become an unofficial sanctuary for the walking wounded of the valley, and Elena had become their unofficial priestess, dispensing healing touch and emotional support with equal generosity. The pattern was so deeply ingrained that Elena rarely questioned its sustainability. When Mrs. Chun from down the path called at midnight because her anxiety was keeping her awake, Elena dressed and walked through the darkness to sit with her until dawn. When her brother texted about his latest job crisis while she was in the middle of her own therapy appointment, she excused herself to call him back immediately. When her friend Maria's relationship ended, Elena canceled her own plans for a weekend retreat to provide round-the-clock emotional support during the breakup. Each act of service felt natural, even virtuous, in the moment of its execution. Elena experienced a familiar rush of purpose when someone reached out to her, a sense of being needed that temporarily filled the hollow spaces inside her chest. The gratitude she received felt like sunlight on her skin. The appreciation others expressed seemed to validate her existence in ways that nothing else could. She had built an identity around being the person others could count on, the one who never said no, the safe harbor in every storm. But beneath this carefully constructed persona, Elena's body was keeping a different score. Her sleep had become increasingly fragmented, interrupted by dreams where she was perpetually late for appointments she couldn't remember making, endlessly searching for people she was supposed to help but couldn't find. Her digestive system rebelled against the irregular meals eaten hastily between helping others. Her immune system weakened under the constant stress of emotional labor that left little energy for her own restoration. Her social interactions had developed a predictable choreography. Others would share their struggles while Elena listened and advised. Others would receive her attention while she rarely mentioned her own challenges. Others would lean on her strength while she learned to hide her own moments of vulnerability. Even her closest friendships had become structured around this dynamic, with Elena playing the role of the wise counselor, the reliable support system, the one who had it all together and could therefore help everyone else figure out their lives. The financial boundaries of her practice had eroded as well. Regular clients who claimed they were going through a rough patch received services at reduced rates that never seemed to return to normal pricing. Acquaintances who mentioned they couldn't afford massage therapy found themselves receiving gift certificates that Elena created and funded herself. Her business account showed a pattern of generosity that would have been admirable if it weren't, slowly draining her ability to maintain her own life. Elena's living space reflected the same boundary dissolution. Her cottage had become an informal community center where people felt welcome to arrive unannounced, knowing they would find warmth, food, and a sympathetic ear. Her kitchen was always stocked, not just for her own needs, but for whoever might stop by hungry. Her guest room was frequently occupied by friends going through transitions who needed a temporary refuge. Her personal time had become a myth, her private space a concept she remembered but rarely experienced. The irony was profound. Elena, who helped others establish healthy boundaries in their relationships, who guided clients toward better work life balance, who counseled friends about the importance of self-care, had created a life that violated every principle she taught. She was like a physician who smoked while advising patients about the dangers of tobacco, a financial advisor who's drowning in debt while helping others create wealth, a therapist who was slowly burning out while teaching others about sustainable living. Yet the pattern persisted because it served multiple functions that Elena wasn't fully conscious of. Each act of service provided temporary relief from the underlying anxiety that whispered she wasn't valuable unless she was useful. Each moment of being needed offered brief respite from the deeper fear that she was fundamentally unlovable unless she was perfectly accommodating. Each successful rescue operation temporarily silenced the inner critic that suggested her own needs were selfish. Her own desires were too much. Her own pain was insignificant compared to others' suffering. The behavioral pattern had become so automatic that Elena rarely noticed the internal negotiations that preceded each choice. When someone asked for help, her body would generate a familiar flutter of anxiety at the thought of saying no. Her mind would immediately begin calculating how she could rearrange her life to accommodate the request, and her mouth would produce agreement before her deeper wisdom had a chance to be consulted. The word no had been surgically removed from her vocabulary in relationship to others' needs, though she used it liberally when it came to her own desires for rest, play, creativity, or simple solitude. The blueprint for Elena's exquisite sensitivity to others' needs had been drawn in the earliest years of her life, when her developing nervous system learned to navigate a household where emotional storms could gather without warning and dissipate just as suddenly. Her mother, Sarah, carried anxiety like a second skin, her worry radiating through their home in waves that seemed to affect the very air they breathed. The smallest disruptions, a bill arriving unexpectedly, a phone call that went unanswered, a change in routine could send Sarah into spirals of catastrophic thinking that filled their cottage with an electric tension everyone could feel, but no one was allowed to acknowledge. Elena's father, David, dealt with his own emotional volatility through explosive bursts of anger that seemed to erupt from nowhere and everywhere at once. A misplaced tool could trigger a tirade about respect and responsibility. A forgotten chore could unleash lectures about gratitude and family obligations. A simple question asked at the wrong moment could result in door-slamming fury that left the whole house walking on eggshells for days. Between these eruptions, David could be charming and affectionate, creating a confusing emotional landscape where love and danger lived side by side. In this environment, young Elena developed what she would later recognize as an extraordinary emotional intelligence born of necessity rather than nature. By age 5, she could read the micro-expressions that preceded her mother's anxiety attacks, adjusting her own behavior to become smaller, quieter, less demanding. She learned to interpret the subtle shifts in her father's posture and tone that signaled approaching anger, becoming a master at deflection and distraction that could sometimes prevent the storm from reaching full intensity. The family system had unconsciously assigned Elena the role of emotional thermostat, the one whose sensitivity to others' states could help regulate the temperature of their shared emotional climate. When her mother began to spiral into worry, Elena learned to become extra helpful, taking on household responsibilities that might ease Sarah's burden and demonstrate that everything was under control. When her father's frustration began to build, Elena became the family comedian, the peacemaker, the one who could lighten the mood through her natural gift for making others feel better. These adaptive strategies earned Elena praise that became as addictive as any substance. Elena is such a thoughtful child, relatives would marvel. She's so mature for her age, teachers would comment. We don't know what we'd do without her, her parents would say. And Elena learned to find her identity in being indispensable, her security in being needed, her worth in being helpful. The price of this praise was the gradual suppression of her own emotional world, which seemed dangerous and selfish compared to the urgent needs surrounding her. Elena's nervous system developed hypervigilance as a survival mechanism, constantly scanning for signs of distress in others that might require her intervention. Her brain learned to prioritize external emotional data over internal signals, to attend to others' needs before her own had even been consciously recognized. The fight-or-flight response that should have been reserved for actual physical danger became activated by the mere possibility that someone around her might be uncomfortable, creating a chronic state of sympathetic nervous system arousal that would persist well into her adult life. The protective function of Elena's people-pleasing was profound and sophisticated. In a household where emotional unpredictability was the norm, becoming indispensable was a form of insurance against abandonment. If she could just be helpful enough, thoughtful enough, sensitive enough to others' needs, perhaps she could create enough stability to feel safe. If she could prevent others' emotional storms through her vigilance and care, perhaps she could avoid becoming the target of their displaced frustration and anxiety. School became an extension of this dynamic, where Elena's teachers appreciated her helpfulness and her classmates learned they could count on her for everything from homework assistance to emotional support. She became the friend others called when they needed to process relationship drama, the student teachers relied on to help struggling classmates, the daughter other parents wished they had because she was so considerate and responsible. Each of these roles provided external validation that temporarily filled the growing void where her own sense of self should have been developing. The tragic irony was that Elena's extraordinary capacity for empathy and care qualities that would become genuine gifts in her adult life were born from a need to survive rather than a desire to serve. The little girl who learned to read others' emotions with laser precision had to abandon her own emotional literacy in the process. The child who became expert at meeting others' needs learned to ignore her own. The young person who developed an almost supernatural ability to provide comfort and healing had never learned to receive these gifts herself. As Elena moved through adolescence, the pattern deepened and solidified. Romantic relationships became opportunities to prove her worth through caregiving. Academic achievements were pursued primarily to make others proud. Career choices were made based on their potential to help people rather than on her own interests and passions. The internal compass that should have guided her toward her authentic self had been recalibrated to point always toward others' needs, others' comfort, others' approval. The family mythology that surrounded Elena's helpfulness made it almost impossible for her to question the pattern. She was the strong one, the caring one, the one who holds everyone together. These labels became a prison disguised as praise, making it feel dangerous to explore what she might be like if she wasn't constantly focused on others' well-being. Who would she be if she wasn't helpful? What would be left of her identity if she removed the role of caretaker? These questions felt too threatening to explore, so the pattern continued, reinforced by every grateful smile, every expression of appreciation, every moment when her caregiving seemed to create the stability and peace. Her nervous system still desperately craved. The protective function of Elena's overgiving had been so essential to her survival that questioning it felt like questioning her right to exist. Yet somewhere deep in her psyche, the authentic self that had been buried under layers of accommodation was still alive, still waiting for the safety and permission to emerge, still holding the possibility of a life where giving and receiving could flow in natural balance rather than in the desperate, one-way current that had defined her existence for so long. The moment of recognition arrived on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, when the valley was dressed in shades of gold and amber that seemed to whisper of transformation. Elena had just finished her third consecutive 18-hour day, a pattern that had become so normal. She barely noticed the exhaustion that lived in her bones, the way her hands trembled slightly as she prepared her morning tea, the fact that she could no longer remember the last time she had eaten a meal without interruption. The call came at 7 in the morning from her friend Jessica, whose voice carried the familiar tone of crisis that had become Elena's alarm clock. "I know it's early, but I'm having a panic attack and my therapist can't see me until Thursday. Could you come over? I just need someone to sit with me until I feel more grounded." Elena's mouth had already formed the word yes before her mind had fully processed the request, her body already moving toward the door before she had consciously decided to leave her cottage. But as she reached for her keys, something unprecedented happened. Elena's body simply stopped moving, not from exhaustion, though that was certainly present, but from a deeper rebellion that seemed to rise from her very cells. Her hand paused inches from the key hook, her nervous system sending signals she hadn't felt in decades, a clear, unmistakable no that resonated from her core like a bell struck in a cathedral. The sensation was so foreign, so unexpected, that Elena stood frozen in her entryway for several minutes, trying to understand what was happening to her. She had never experienced her body refusing to accommodate others' needs. She had never felt her own boundary assert itself so clearly, so definitively, without consultation with her conscious mind. The feeling was simultaneously terrifying and liberating, like discovering she had muscles she never knew existed. Elena looked around her cottage with eyes that seemed to belong to someone else, seeing for the first time the accumulated evidence of a life lived entirely in service to others. The unwashed dishes from meals she had prepared for friends going through difficult times. The therapy books she had been reading to better help her clients, though she hadn't read anything for her own pleasure in months. The yoga mat that hadn't been unrolled in weeks because every morning had been claimed by someone else's emergency. She picked up her phone to call Jessica back, to explain that she was feeling unwell and couldn't come over, but found herself staring at the screen as if she had forgotten how to use it. The simple act of prioritizing her own needs over someone else's felt like learning a foreign language, like trying to write with her non-dominant hand. Every instinct screamed that she was being selfish, that Jessica needed her, that her discomfort was insignificant compared to her friend's panic. But the rebellion in her body intensified rather than subsided. Elena sank into her kitchen chair, finally allowing herself to feel the bone-deep exhaustion that had been accumulating for years. Her nervous system, which had been locked in a state of hypervigilance for so long she had forgotten what calm felt like, began to send her information she had been ignoring for decades. the tension in her shoulders from carrying everyone else's emotional weight, the anxiety in her stomach from constantly anticipating others' needs, the loneliness in her heart from relationships where she gave everything and received fragments. 4. The first time in her adult life, Elena allowed herself to ask a question that felt revolutionary. What do I need right now? The inquiry hung in the air of her cottage like incense, foreign and sacred. Her mind immediately generated a list of what others needed. Jessica needed support. Her client needed an earlier appointment. Her mother needed a call. Her neighbor needed help with groceries. But beneath this familiar mental chatter, a quieter voice whispered answers that belonged entirely to her. She needed rest. Real rest. Not the collapsed exhaustion that came after giving everything to others, but the nourishing restoration that came from choosing ease over obligation. She needed silence. Not the temporary quiet between crises, but sustained periods where she could hear her own thoughts without the constant background noise of others' expectations. She needed to remember what brought her joy independent of others' happiness, what sparked her creativity independent of others' needs, what made her feel alive independent of others' gratitude. The recognition that her entire life had been constructed around avoiding this moment, this simple acknowledgement of her own needs, hit Elena with the force of revelation. Every yes she had given when she meant no, every boundary she had dissolved in service of others' comfort, every time she had chosen accommodation over authenticity had been building toward this moment of reckoning. She was 44 years old and had never learned to receive the love she gave so freely, had never discovered what she desired when she wasn't focused on fulfilling others' desires. Elena called Jessica back, her voice shaking with the unfamiliarity of the words. I'm not able to come over this morning. I know you're struggling, and I care about you, but I need to take care of myself right now. Can you call your therapist's emergency line, or maybe reach out to someone else in your support network? The conversation that followed was awkward and uncomfortable, filled with Jessica's surprise and Elena's guilt. But something in Elena's core remained solid, unmovable, finally awake to its own validity. As she hung up the phone, Elena felt simultaneously like she had betrayed everything she believed about herself, and like she had finally come home to something she had lost long ago. The cottage around her looked the same, but everything had shifted. The pattern that had governed her life for decades had encountered something stronger than itself, her own deep longing for balance, for mutuality, for relationships where love flowed in multiple directions rather than in the single stream that had been slowly draining her life force. The recognition that change was not only possible, but necessary settled into Elena's awareness like seeds, finding fertile soil. She didn't know how to transform the patterns that had shaped her existence, didn't understand the steps that would lead her toward the balance she suddenly craved. But she knew with cellular certainty that she could not continue living as she had been. The part of herself that had been buried under layers of accommodation was stirring, demanding attention, asking to be included in the conversation about how to live. 3 days after Elena's unprecedented moment of saying no, she found herself walking the mountain path that wound through the upper reaches of the valley, drawn by a restlessness she couldn't name and a need for perspective that felt urgent. Her body was still adjusting to the foreign sensation of having honored her own needs, still processing the guilt that alternated with surprising moments of relief, still learning to navigate the unfamiliar territory of self-advocacy. The path Elena chose led to a grove of ancient redwoods that had stood sentinel over the valley for centuries, their massive trunks holding the memory of countless seasons, their canopy creating a natural cathedral where light filtered through in golden streams. As she walked deeper into this sacred space, her nervous system began to settle for the first time in days. The hypervigilance that had become her default state gradually giving way to something approaching peace. It was in this grove that Elena encountered Miriam, an elderly woman who seemed to emerge from the forest itself, her presence so natural among the towering trees that she might have been growing there for decades. Miriam moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had learned to trust the rhythm of her own being, her silver hair catching sunlight like spun moonbeams, her eyes holding the kind of wisdom that comes only from having traveled the full cycle of learning to give and receive in equal measure. "You look like someone who has just discovered she has needs," Miriam observed, settling onto a fallen log with the ease of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. Her voice carried neither judgment nor curiosity, simply the kind recognition of one who had walked similar paths. Elena found herself sitting down as well, though she couldn't have explained why the stranger felt so immediately trustworthy. "I've always had needs," Elena replied automatically, then stopped, surprised by the defensiveness in her own voice. "I mean, everyone has needs. I just ... I've never been good at ... She trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the revelation that was still taking shape inside her consciousness. Miriam nodded with the patience of someone who had guided many souls through the labyrinth of self-discovery. "Tell me about the last time someone took care of you," she said gently. "Not the last time someone appreciated your care, not the last time someone thanked you for your help, but the last time someone saw that you were struggling and offered you support without you having to ask for it." The question landed in Elena's awareness like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread through decades of memory. She searched her recent experiences, then her more distant past, looking for moments when she had been the recipient rather than the provider of care. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of wind through the redwood branches, as Elena realized that the question had exposed a poverty she hadn't known she was living in. "I can't remember," Elena admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The admission felt like confessing to a crime she hadn't known she was committing. "People care about me, I know they do. They tell me all the time how grateful they are, how much they appreciate me. But I don't think anyone has ever. I don't usually need." Again, she found herself unable to complete the sentence, the words catching in her throat like fishbones. "What if," Miriam suggested, "your inability to receive care isn't a strength but a barrier? What if the armor you wear to protect others from your needs is also protecting you from the love you crave?" Her words carried no judgment, only the gentle invitation to consider a perspective that had never occurred to Elena. Miriam began to share her own story, speaking of a younger self who had been trapped in similar patterns, who had believed that love was something to be earned through service, rather than something to be received as a birthright. She spoke of the decades she had spent learning to distinguish between authentic generosity and compulsive giving, between healthy compassion and anxious rescue, between love that flowed freely and love that carried the hidden price tag of her own unmet needs. "The trees around us," Miriam gestured to the towering redwoods, "are among the most generous organisms on Earth. They share nutrients through their root systems. They provide oxygen to the world. They offer shelter and beauty to countless other beings. But notice they also take what they need. They draw water from the earth. They reach for sunlight. They shed their needles when it serves their health. Their generosity is sustainable because it includes themselves in the circle of care." Elena felt something inside her chest beginning to crack open, like ice breaking up on a frozen pond in spring. The metaphor resonated in places she hadn't known existed, speaking to a part of herself that had been waiting decades to be acknowledged. "But how do you learn to receive when everyone knows you as the giver?" she asked. "How do you change patterns that define your relationships?" Very slowly, Miriam replied with a smile that held both compassion and mischief, and with great patience for the discomfort that comes with growing. The caterpillar doesn't become a butterfly overnight, and the transformation isn't comfortable. But the alternative, remaining forever trapped in patterns that no longer serve, becomes unbearable once you've glimpsed the possibility of flight. Miriam reached into her bag and pulled out a smooth river stone, its surface polished by countless years of water's gentle persistence. "This stone was once sharp and jagged," she said, placing it in Elena's palm. "The river didn't force it to become smooth through violence, but through endless repetition of gentle pressure. Your transformation will happen the same way, not through dramatic overhaul, but through countless small choices to include yourself in your own circle of compassion." As Elena held the stone, feeling its weight and warmth, Miriam posed a question that would echo in her consciousness for weeks to come. What would your life look like if you loved yourself with the same tenderness you show others? What would change if you offered yourself the same patience, the same understanding, the same benefit of the doubt that you give so freely to everyone else? The conversation continued as the afternoon light shifted through the forest canopy, touching on the fear that often underlies compulsive giving, the terror that if we stop being useful, we might discover we're not lovable. Miriam spoke of the courage required to test this fear, to risk finding out whether relationships built on our utility can evolve into connections based on our humanity. "The most radical thing you can do," Miriam said as their time together drew toward its natural conclusion, "is to start treating your own needs as valid information rather than inconvenient obstacles. Your exhaustion is data. Your resentment is communication. Your longing is guidance. These feelings aren't problems to be solved, but messages to be received." As Elena prepared to leave the grove, Miriam offered one final gift. "For the next week, practice saying these words: 'That doesn't work for me.' You don't need to explain, justify, or apologize. You don't need to offer alternatives or solutions. Simply practice allowing your own preferences to have as much validity as everyone else's." Walking back down the mountain path, Elena felt as if she were carrying more than just Miriam's stone in her pocket. Something fundamental had shifted. In her understanding of herself, in her conception of what it meant to be loving, in her definition of what it meant to be good. The grove had become a portal, and she was returning to her life as a slightly different person than the one who had climbed the path just hours before. The cottage that greeted her at the end of her walk looked the same as it had that morning, but Elena's relationship to it had begun to evolve. Instead of immediately checking her phone for messages that might require her attention, she placed Miriam's stone on her kitchen windowsill and made herself a cup of tea. Instead of scanning her environment for tasks that needed completing, she sat in her favorite chair and simply existed for 10 minutes without productivity or purpose. The revolutionary act of prioritizing her own restoration after the emotional labor of the conversation with Miriam felt simultaneously selfish and necessary, wrong and right, foreign and familiar. Elena was beginning to understand that transformation wouldn't be a single dramatic event, but a series of small choices, each one an act of rebellion against patterns that had governed her life for decades. The week following Elena's encounter with Miriam became a laboratory for experimentation, a time when she began to test the boundaries of her own identity and discover what remained when she stopped being perpetually available to others' needs. The phrase, "that doesn't work for me," felt clumsy in her mouth at first, like speaking a language she had studied but never practiced. But Elena committed to Miriam's challenge with the same dedication she had once brought to meeting everyone else's expectations. The first opportunity arrived within hours of her return from the grove. Her client Margaret called to request an emergency massage session, explaining that her anxiety had spiked and she needed Elena's healing touch to feel grounded again. Elena's habitual response would have been immediate accommodation, a rearrangement of her evening plans to provide the support Margaret needed. Instead, She heard herself saying words that felt like stepping off a cliff. "That doesn't work for me tonight, Margaret. I have an opening Thursday afternoon if that would help." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough for Elena to nearly retract her boundary, to offer the familiar apology and accommodation that would restore the comfortable dynamic. But she gripped Miriam's stone in her pocket and waited, allowing Margaret to process this unprecedented experience of Elena's unavailability. When Margaret finally responded, her voice carried surprise, but also a grudging respect. "Thursday would be fine. I hope you're taking care of yourself, Elena." Each subsequent boundary felt like a small earthquake in Elena's carefully constructed world. When her neighbor asked her to dog sit for the weekend, Elena discovered that saying, "That doesn't work for me," created space for her neighbor to find alternative arrangements rather than the apocalyptic scenario her anxiety had predicted. When her mother called with the latest family drama requiring Elena's mediation, the boundary phrase allowed her to listen with compassion while refusing to take responsibility for solving problems that weren't hers to solve. But the experimentation wasn't limited to saying no. Elena began exploring what happened when she allowed herself to express preferences, to voice opinions, to take up space in conversations in ways she had trained herself to avoid. At the weekly Valley community gathering, instead of automatically volunteering to coordinate the upcoming harvest festival, Elena simply listened as others discussed their ideas. The strange sensation of not immediately stepping forward to manage everyone else's needs felt like discovering she had been holding her breath for decades. Even more revolutionary was Elena's experiment with asking for help. When her car broke down on a rainy Tuesday, instead of walking 3 miles to the mechanic shop while figuring out how to solve everyone else's transportation needs, she called her friend David and simply said, "I need a ride to the mechanic. Are you available?" The experience of being helped without having to earn it through prior service felt surreal, like receiving an unexpected gift she hadn't known she was allowed to want. Elena's massage practice became another laboratory for boundary experimentation. She began ending sessions on time rather than allowing them to extend indefinitely when clients wanted to process emotional material. She started charging her full rate rather than offering endless discounts to people who claimed financial hardship. She implemented a policy requiring 24 hours notice for cancellations rather than absorbing the financial loss of last-minute changes that had become routine. The resistance to these changes came not only from others but from Elena's own nervous system, which had been trained to interpret her boundary setting as dangerous. Each time she honored her own needs over others' expectations, her body would generate familiar sensations of anxiety, guilt, and the urgent need to fix whatever discomfort her boundaries had created. But Elena began to recognize these feelings as information rather than instructions, as the predictable protest of old patterns encountering new possibilities. Her relationship with her physical space evolved as well. Elena began closing her cottage door during certain hours, hanging a small sign that read "Restoration Time," rather than maintaining constant availability for unexpected visitors. She established one evening per week that belonged entirely to her own pleasure, whether that meant reading a novel, taking a long bath, or simply sitting in her garden without feeling obligated to weed or water or improve anything. The most challenging experiment involved Elena's relationship with her family, where the patterns of overfunctioning had been established earliest and ran deepest. When her sister called to complain about their mother's latest criticism, Elena found herself saying, "I hear how frustrated you are. What do you think you want to do about it?" rather than immediately strategizing solutions. When her brother requested a loan to cover expenses from his latest impulsive purchase, Elena responded, "That doesn't work for me right now," rather than automatically reaching for her checkbook. Each boundary created ripples in Elena's relational ecosystem. Some people responded with understanding and even relief, as if they had been waiting for permission to stop relying on Elena's unlimited availability. Others pushed back with guilt, manipulation, or withdrawal, revealing the transactional nature of connections she had believed were based on genuine affection. The process of discovering which relationships could evolve to include her autonomy and which ones had been built entirely on her accommodation was painful but illuminating. Elena's body began to respond to these changes with sensations she hadn't experienced in years. She woke up one morning and realized she felt rested rather than immediately scanning for others' needs. She noticed her appetite returning, her interest in activities that brought her joy rather than just serving others' happiness. Her chronic shoulder tension began to ease as she stopped carrying the weight of everyone else's emotional burdens. But the most profound shift was internal. Elena began to notice a voice inside her consciousness that she had suppressed for so long she had forgotten it existed. Her own authentic preferences, desires, and wisdom. When someone asked what she wanted for dinner, instead of automatically deferring to others' choices, she discovered she had opinions. When friends discussed weekend plans, instead of immediately organizing activities for everyone else's enjoyment, she found herself expressing what would bring her pleasure. The experimentation phase revealed that Elena's identity was far more complex and robust than the single note of service she had been playing for decades. She discovered she was funny when she wasn't constantly worried about others' comfort, creative when she had energy that wasn't immediately channeled into others' projects, and wise in ways that extended beyond her ability to solve others' problems. As the week progressed, Elena noticed that her relationships weren't dissolving as her catastrophic thinking had predicted, but rather beginning to recalibrate. People who had become accustomed to her unlimited availability started to plan ahead rather than assuming she would always be free. Friends who had relied on her for emotional regulation began developing their own coping resources. Family members who had expected her to manage their conflicts started having direct conversations with each other. The experimental phase wasn't comfortable. Elena often felt like she was betraying fundamental aspects of herself while simultaneously discovering parts of her identity that had been dormant for years. But something in her core recognized this discomfort as growing pains rather than evidence of wrongdoing, as the natural result of expanding beyond patterns that had become too small to contain her evolving consciousness. The breakthrough arrived on a Thursday evening in late autumn, when the valley was settling into the quiet introspection that accompanies the transition toward winter. Elena had been practicing her new boundaries for 3 weeks, each day bringing small victories and larger questions about who she was becoming in the space between her old patterns and her emerging authenticity. She had grown more comfortable with the phrase, "that doesn't work for me," had begun to recognize her own needs as valid information, and had started to distinguish between genuine generosity and compulsive accommodation. The catalyst for transformation came in the form of a crisis that would have once consumed Elena entirely. Her friend Maria's husband had been hospitalized following a heart attack, and Maria was spiraling into the kind of panic that had historically triggered Elena's most intense rescue behaviors. The call came at 9 in the evening, Maria's voice fractured with terror and disbelief, asking Elena to come to the hospital immediately to provide the emotional support that would help her navigate this terrifying uncertainty. Elena's body responded. With its familiar flood of adrenaline, her nervous system immediately shifting into crisis mode, her mind beginning the automatic calculation of how to rearrange her life to meet this emergency. She was already reaching for her keys when something unprecedented happened. She paused, not from hesitation or selfishness, but from a deeper wisdom that seemed to rise from the same place where Miriam's stone rested in her pocket. Instead of immediately rushing to the hospital, Elena found herself asking a question that had never occurred to her before. What does Maria actually need right now? And am I the best person to provide it? The inquiry opened a space for consideration that had never existed in her previous response patterns, a moment of reflection that allowed her to see the situation from multiple perspectives, rather than just through the lens of her own compulsive availability. Elena realized that what Maria needed most was not another person in the hospital room, but practical support that would allow her to focus entirely on her husband's care, rather than providing emotional hand-holding that might actually increase Maria's dependence and anxiety. Elena could offer something more valuable, concrete assistance that would remove obstacles from Maria's path during this crisis. "Maria," Elena said, her voice carrying a calmness that surprised them both, "I want to help you in the most useful way possible. Instead of coming to the hospital, what if I go to your house and take care of the things there that you don't need to worry about right now? I could feed your cats, collect your mail, water your plants, and make sure everything is secure so you can stay with your husband as long as you need to." The suggestion created a pause in Maria's panic, a moment where she shifted from emotional reaction to practical consideration. "That would actually be incredibly helpful," Maria admitted. "I've been worrying about the cats, and I forgot to lock the back door in my rush to get here." Elena could hear in her friend's voice the relief that comes from receiving exactly the right kind of support at exactly the right moment. As Elena drove to Maria's house, she experienced a revelation that felt like stepping into sunlight after years in shadow. The help she was providing felt clean, uncomplicated by her own emotional needs, free from the subtle resentment that had often accompanied her rescue efforts when they were motivated more by her need to be needed than by clear assessment of what would actually serve the situation. At Maria's house, Elena methodically attended to the practical details that would give her friend peace of mind: feeding the anxious cats, setting timers for the lights, collecting the mail and newspapers that would otherwise pile up and signal an empty house. Each task felt grounded in genuine service rather than performed from the frantic energy of emotional over-involvement that had characterized her previous crisis responses. But the real breakthrough came when Elena finished her tasks and realized she felt complete. There was no urge to drive to the hospital, no anxiety about whether she was doing enough, no guilt about not being physically present during Maria's crisis. For the first time in her adult life, Elena had provided help that was precisely calibrated to what was actually needed rather than what her own emotional system demanded she provide. The drive home took Elena past the grove where she had met Miriam, and she felt compelled to stop, to sit for a moment among the ancient redwoods that had witnessed her first glimpse of a different way of being. In the darkness, with only starlight filtering through the canopy above, Elena experienced a shift in her fundamental understanding of love, service, and her own worth that felt like a tectonic plate moving in her consciousness. She finally understood the difference between love that flows from abundance and love that flows from need. Her historical pattern of overgiving had been motivated by her own emotional requirements: the need to feel valued, the need to avoid abandonment, the need to prove her worth through usefulness. But tonight she had offered help that was purely for Maria's benefit, uncomplicated by Elena's own psychological agenda, clean of her own unmet needs. The revelation expanded as Elena sat in the cathedral silence of the grove. She saw how her compulsive helping had often been a form of control disguised as service, a way of managing her own anxiety about others' pain, rather than truly supporting their capacity to handle their own challenges. She recognized how her inability to receive care had actually limited her ability to give it cleanly, how her own unmet needs had contaminated even her most generous gestures. But most profoundly, Elena experienced a moment of absolute knowing that her worth was not contingent on her usefulness. Sitting in the darkness surrounded by trees that existed in perfect balance between giving and receiving, she felt her identity expanding beyond the narrow confines of the caretaker role that had defined her for decades. She was valuable not because of what she could provide, but because of who she was, a conscious being worthy of love, care, and consideration simply by virtue of her existence. The emotional release that followed was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. Decades of suppressed grief poured through her system, grief for the little girl who had learned to earn love through service, grief for the woman who had never learned to receive the care she gave so freely, grief for all the relationships that had been built on her accommodation rather than her authenticity. But alongside the grief was relief so profound it felt like coming home to herself after a lifetime of exile. When Elena finally returned to her cottage, she moved through her evening routine with a presence and peace she had never known. She didn't check her phone for messages that might require her attention. She didn't scan her environment for tasks that needed completing. She simply existed in her own space, in her own body, in her own life, with a sense of belonging to herself that felt revolutionary. The breakthrough had fundamentally altered Elena's relationship to giving and receiving, to service and self-care, to love and boundaries. She understood viscerally that sustainable compassion required including herself in the circle of care, that authentic service flowed from wholeness rather than emptiness, that the most loving thing she could do for others was to model what it looked like to honor one's own needs alongside others' well-being. As Elena prepared for sleep that night, she placed Miriam's stone on her bedside table and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the courage to change, for the wisdom to recognize her own worth, for the possibility of relationships built on mutuality rather than accommodation. The woman who lay down to rest was fundamentally different from the one who had awakened that morning, not because she loved others less, but because she had finally learned to include herself in the love she offered to the world. The weeks following Elena's profound breakthrough brought an unexpected visitor: doubt. Not the paralyzing uncertainty that had once kept her trapped in patterns of compulsive giving, but a different kind of questioning that seemed to arise from the very depths of her psyche, challenging the foundations of her newly constructed identity. As autumn deepened into winter, Elena found herself in what mystics call the dark night of the soul, a necessary passage through terrain that felt simultaneously foreign and essential to her continued growth. The doubt manifested first as subtle whispers that grew louder during quiet moments. Had she become selfish in her pursuit of balance? Were her boundaries actually walls that kept love at bay? Was her newfound self-care simply a sophisticated form of self-indulgence disguised as wisdom? These questions arose not from her old patterns reasserting themselves, but from a deeper psychological process that was refining her understanding of authentic love and service. Elena's cottage, which had become a sanctuary of peace and balanced living, suddenly felt too quiet, too separate from the suffering she witnessed in the world beyond her garden walls. The global news carried stories of poverty, war, and environmental destruction that made her own journey toward self-care seem trivial by comparison. How could she focus on her own needs when children were starving, when refugees were displaced, when the earth itself was crying out for help? The internal conflict was particularly acute because Elena's sensitivity to others' pain had not diminished through her healing process. If anything, her increased wholeness had made her more acutely aware of the interconnected web of suffering that touched every corner of human experience. The difference was that she no longer felt compelled to sacrifice herself in futile attempts to fix what was beyond her individual capacity to heal. This period of questioning led Elena into a deeper exploration of what she began to call right-sized service, finding her authentic place in the larger ecosystem of healing, without falling back into patterns of over-functioning or withdrawing into self-protective isolation. She spent long evenings walking the winter paths of the valley, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. allowing the complexity of conscious living to challenge her understanding without demanding immediate resolution. The doubt served as a refining fire, burning away any remaining traces of spiritual materialism or therapeutic bypassing that might have crept into her transformation. Elena discovered that true healing was not a destination where all questions were answered, but a way of being that could hold uncertainty with grace, that could act from love even when the outcomes were unclear, that could serve authentically even when the impact was unmeasurable. Through this descent into uncertainty, Elena learned to distinguish between the voice of authentic conscience, which called her toward greater alignment with her values, and the voice of internalized criticism that sought to undermine her progress through shame and self-doubt. The former felt like a gentle tuning fork that helped her adjust her choices toward greater harmony, while the latter carried the familiar energy of the old patterns that had once driven her compulsive helping. This phase of her journey required a different kind of courage than the initial breakthrough had demanded. Now Elena needed the strength to remain present with questions that had no clear answers, to continue practicing boundaries even when their validity was challenged by internal and external voices, to trust her own discernment even when well-meaning. Others suggested she was becoming too focused on herself. As Elena moved deeper into the winter of her questioning, a profound realization began to emerge about the ancestral patterns that had shaped her compulsive giving. Through dreams, meditation, and quiet reflection, she began to sense the presence of her grandmother, her great-grandmother, and generations of women before them who had carried similar burdens of over-responsibility and self-sacrifice. Elena's grandmother had been a woman who gave endlessly to her family, community, and anyone who crossed her path, earning praise for her selflessness while slowly disappearing into the role of perpetual caretaker. Her great-grandmother had been the one everyone turned to during the Great Depression, feeding neighbors when her own family barely had enough, managing everyone's emotional and practical needs while her own desires withered from neglect. These women had been heroes in their own right, their generosity keeping families and communities afloat during difficult times. But Elena began to understand that what had been adaptive and necessary survival strategies for previous generations had become maladaptive patterns in her own life. The hypervigilance that had helped her ancestors navigate genuine threats had become chronic anxiety in Elena's relatively safe world. The self-sacrifice that had been essential for group survival had become self-abandonment that served no one's highest good. Through a process that felt like communing with the spirits of her female lineage, Elena began to sense that her healing was not just personal but ancestral. Each boundary she set, each moment of self-compassion she practiced, each time she chose to receive love rather than only give it, created healing ripples that seemed to travel backward and forward through time, touching the lives of women who had come before and those who would come after. This recognition brought both profound sadness and unexpected relief. Elena grieved for the generations of women who had never learned to include themselves in their own love, who had carried the weight of everyone else's needs without knowing they had the right to be cared for as well. She felt the accumulated exhaustion of her maternal line, the collective longing for permission to rest, to be seen, to matter independent of their usefulness to others. But alongside the grief came a sense of purpose that transcended her individual healing. Elena understood that her journey toward balance and authentic service was contributing to the healing of her entire lineage, creating new possibilities for future generations of women in her family who might learn to love without losing themselves, to give without depleting their own life force. The ancestral healing work required Elena to forgive not just her own patterns, but the unconscious perpetuation of self-sacrifice that had been passed down through generations of women who had done their best with the resources and understanding available to them. She learned to honor the survival wisdom of her ancestors while choosing a different path that honored both service and self-care, both love for others and love for herself. This deeper layer of healing helped Elena understand that her transformation was part of a larger cultural shift toward more sustainable ways of loving and serving. She was not just healing herself, but participating in the evolution of human consciousness toward greater balance between individual and collective needs, between masculine and feminine energies, between doing and being done. As winter began its slow retreat toward spring, Elena emerged from her period of questioning with a deeper, more nuanced understanding of service that integrated all she had learned about boundaries, self-care, and ancestral healing. The return to active engagement with others' needs felt different now, less compulsive and more conscious, less driven by her own emotional requirements, and more aligned with authentic wisdom about where her gifts could make the greatest impact. Elena's massage practice resumed with a clarity of purpose that had been absent even during her initial boundary-setting phase. Each session became a sacred collaboration between her skills and her client's innate healing capacity, with Elena serving as a facilitator rather than a rescuer, holding space for transformation while trusting the inherent wisdom of each person's healing process. Her touch carried the quality of someone who had learned to receive as well as give, creating permission for clients to experience the same integration. The informal teaching that had emerged from Elena's transformation evolved into a more structured offering as she began facilitating monthly workshops on sustainable caregiving for others in helping professions. These gatherings attracted nurses, teachers, therapists, and social workers who recognized in Elena someone who had successfully navigated the treacherous waters between professional compassion and personal depletion. Her teaching carried the authority of lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Elena's relationship with her family underwent another evolution as she learned to offer support that truly served their growth rather than enabling their dependence. When her brother faced another financial crisis, instead of providing money or immediate rescue, Elena offered to help him develop a budget and explore the underlying patterns that kept creating these emergencies. When her mother called with anxiety about family dynamics, Elena listened with compassion while gently redirecting her mother toward her own resources and wisdom. The Valley community began to benefit from Elena's more refined understanding of service as she took on a leadership role in developing sustainable practices for their seasonal festivals and community projects. Her influence helped create systems where responsibilities were shared more equitably, where people contributed according to their capacity rather than their guilt, where the work of community building was distributed in ways that honored everyone's needs and limitations. Elena's creative expression became another vehicle for service, as her paintings and writing began to reach people far beyond the Valley, who were struggling with similar patterns of overgiving and boundary confusion. Her artwork captured the emotional landscape of transformation in ways that spoke directly to others' experiences, offering hope and recognition to anyone who felt trapped in patterns of compulsive helping. The return to service felt like coming home to herself in a way that Elena had never experienced before. She was no longer serving from depletion or compulsion, but from overflow and choice, no longer rescuing others from their own growth opportunities, but supporting their capacity to navigate challenges with increased skill and confidence. Her help became more effective because it was offered strategically rather than automatically, more appreciated because it was given freely rather than from obligation. Most importantly, Elena discovered that her capacity for genuine service had actually increased through learning to care for herself, that her ability to help others had been enhanced rather than diminished by her commitment to her own well-being. The integration of self-care and service had created a sustainable foundation for contributing to others' lives without sacrificing her own vitality and authentic self-expression. The months that followed Elena's breakthrough unfolded like a careful architecture of new habits, each day providing opportunities to practice the delicate art of balanced living that honored both her generous spirit and her own fundamental needs. The cottage that had once felt like a way station for others' crises gradually transformed into a sanctuary where Elena could rest, create, and exist without the constant background hum of hypervigilance that had defined her previous way of being. Elena's morning routine became a sacred practice of self-attunement rather than immediate availability to others' emergencies. She began each day with 10 minutes of sitting quietly in her garden, not meditating in any formal sense, but simply allowing her nervous system to remember what calm felt like, letting her consciousness settle into her own body before extending outward to engage with others' needs. This simple practice created a foundation of centeredness that influenced every subsequent interaction throughout her day. Her massage therapy practice evolved to reflect her newfound understanding of sustainable service. Elena implemented clear policies about session length, payment terms, and emergency availability that honor both her clients' needs and her own. Professional boundaries. She discovered that when she showed up fully present within clearly defined containers, her healing work became more potent rather than less effective. Clients responded to her increased groundedness with deeper trust, finding that her relaxed authority created more safety than her previous anxious accommodation ever had. The transformation in Elena's personal relationships required the most careful navigation as people adjusted to interacting with someone who no longer absorbed their emotional overflow or immediately solved their practical problems. Some friends initially responded to her boundaries with confusion or mild resentment, testing whether her changes were permanent or simply a phase they could wait out. But Elena's consistent kindness, combined with her unwavering self-respect, gradually educated her social circle about new ways of connecting that were based on mutuality rather than her perpetual availability. Her friendship with Jessica, the woman whose panic attack had triggered Elena's first conscious boundary, slowly evolved into something more balanced and genuinely supportive. Instead of calling Elena during every crisis, Jessica began developing her own emotional regulation skills while also learning to offer reciprocal support when Elena faced challenges. Their conversations became exchanges rather than monologues, their time together nourishing for both participants rather than depleting for one and temporarily reassuring for the other. Elena's family relationships required even more patience and persistence as deeply embedded patterns slowly shifted. Her mother gradually stopped treating Elena as the family's emotional manager, learning to have direct conversations with other family members rather than routing all communication through Elena's diplomatic intervention. Her brother's requests for financial bailouts decreased as he learned to manage his own resources more carefully, no longer confident that Elena would automatically rescue him from the consequences of his impulsive decisions. The cottage itself reflected Elena's internal transformation. The guest room that had been perpetually occupied by friends in transition became a creative studio where Elena explored painting and writing, artistic expressions that served no purpose beyond her own joy and fulfillment. The kitchen, while still welcoming to others, was no longer maintained as a constant resource for anyone who might arrive hungry or needing comfort food. Elena learned to cook for herself with the same care she had once reserved for others, discovering that nourishing her own body was an act of reverence rather than selfishness. Elena's relationship with time underwent a fundamental restructuring. Instead of allowing her schedule to be determined entirely by others' urgencies, she began protecting certain hours for her own rest, creativity, and simple pleasure. Thursday evenings became inviolate time for reading novels that had no therapeutic purpose. Saturday mornings were reserved for long walks in the valley without any agenda beyond her own enjoyment. And Sunday afternoons belonged to whatever spontaneous activity brought her delight. the practice of receiving became a conscious discipline for Elena, requiring the same intentional development as any other skill. When neighbors offered to help with her garden, she practiced saying yes rather than insisting she could handle everything herself. When friends invited her to events they were hosting, she learned to accept their hospitality without immediately calculating how she could reciprocate. When her massage therapy colleagues suggested referring clients to her practice, she allowed herself to receive their professional support without feeling obligated to return the favor immediately. Elena's nervous system slowly recalibrated from its default state of hypervigilance to something approaching natural alertness. The chronic tension in her shoulders began to dissolve as she stopped carrying the weight of everyone else's emotional burdens. Her sleep improved as her mind learned to rest rather than continuously processing others' problems. Her appetite returned as she began eating meals without the distraction of others' needs interrupting her own nourishment. The most surprising aspect of Elena's transformation was discovering that her capacity for genuine service actually increased as her compulsive helping decreased. When she offered assistance from a place of choice rather than obligation, from abundance rather than need, her help became more effective and more appreciated. People began seeking her guidance not because they knew she would say yes to everything, but because they trusted that when she did offer support, it came from authentic wisdom rather than anxious accommodation. Elena's practice of discernment became increasingly sophisticated as she learned to distinguish between requests that aligned with her values and capacity, and those that primarily served others' avoidance of their own growth and responsibility. She developed an internal compass that could sense the difference between genuine need and manufactured crisis, between requests for support and demands for rescue, between opportunities for meaningful service and invitations to enable others. Dysfunction. The financial aspects of Elena's life stabilized as she stopped subsidizing others, poor planning, and started charging appropriately for her professional services. Her massage practice became more profitable as she attracted clients who valued her expertise enough to pay her full rates and respect her policies. Her personal expenses decreased as she stopped automatically covering costs for friends who claimed financial hardship but continued making poor spending decisions. Elena's home became a place of genuine hospitality rather than compulsive availability. When she invited people for dinner, it was because she desired their company rather than because she felt obligated to feed them. When friends visited, they came by invitation rather than assumption, allowing Elena to prepare for their presence, rather than constantly maintain readiness for unexpected arrivals. The energy of her space shifted from anxious availability to peaceful welcome. As spring returned to the valley, Elena's transformation had settled into her bones like nutrients absorbed by soil, creating a foundation of self-compassion that informed every aspect of her daily existence. The woman who had once measured her worth through others' gratitude now possessed an internal compass calibrated to her own authentic values, able to offer genuine service without losing herself in the process of giving. Elena's internal dialogue underwent a complete revolution, shifting from the harsh criticism that had once driven her compulsive helping to a gentle authority that honored both her generous impulses and her legitimate needs. Instead of the familiar voices that whispered she was selfish for having boundaries or lazy for resting, Elena developed an inner advocate who reminded her that sustainable love required sustainable self-care. That authentic service flowed from wholeness rather than depletion. The practice of emotional regulation became second nature as Elena learned to feel her feelings without immediately acting to fix or change them. When sadness arose, she allowed it to move through her system without rushing to help someone else as a distraction. When anger surfaced, she explored its message rather than suppressing it to maintain her image as perpetually pleasant. When fear appeared, she investigated its wisdom rather than reflexively seeking the comfort of being needed by others. Alana's relationship with difficult emotions transformed from avoidance to curiosity. She began to recognize anger as information about violated boundaries, sadness as data about unmet needs, and anxiety as guidance about situations that required her attention. Instead of immediately channeling these feelings into caregiving activities that temporarily numbed her own discomfort, Elena learned to sit with emotional intensity until its message became clear. Boundary setting evolved from the clumsy use of Miriam's phrase "that doesn't work for me" to an elegant art form that honored both Elena's limits and others' dignity. She learned to say no with such kindness and clarity that people rarely felt rejected, instead understanding that her boundaries created space for more authentic connection. Her refusals became gifts that invited others to develop their own resources, rather than remaining dependent on her unlimited availability. Elena discovered that self-compassion wasn't a luxury but a necessity, not selfishness but wisdom, not weakness but the foundation of sustainable strength. She learned to speak to herself with the same gentleness she had always offered others, to forgive her mistakes with the same grace she extended to friends' failures, to celebrate her accomplishments with the same enthusiasm she had shown for others' successes. The art of receiving became as natural as breathing through consistent practice and gentle persistence. Elena learned to accept compliments without deflecting them, to receive gifts without immediately calculating reciprocation, to allow others to care for her without feeling like a burden. She discovered that receiving well was actually a gift. To the giver, that her graceful acceptance of others' offerings honored their desire to contribute to her well-being. Elena's capacity for discernment reached remarkable sophistication as she learned to distinguish between her authentic intuition and her conditioned responses. She could sense the difference between genuine guidance and anxiety-driven impulses, between inspired action and compulsive activity, between love that flowed freely and love that carried hidden agendas. This discrimination allowed her to offer help that truly served, rather than help that primarily met her own emotional needs. The practice of presence became Elena's greatest gift to others, replacing her former habit of anxious problem-solving with the deeper offering of witnessing and acceptance. She learned that often what people needed most wasn't her advice or intervention, but simply her calm attention, her willingness to be with them in their experience without trying to change or fix anything. This quality of presence proved more healing than all her previous rescue efforts combined. Elena's professional work was transformed by her personal healing, as clients began seeking her services not just for physical relief, but for the profound sense of being truly seen and accepted that flowed from her own self-acceptance. Her touch carried the quality of someone who had learned to inhabit her own body with kindness. Her listening reflected the spaciousness of someone who no longer needed to fill every silence with helpful suggestions. The integration of shadow aspects, the parts of herself Elena had previously deemed unacceptable, allowed her to show up more authentically in all her relationships. She learned to acknowledge her own selfishness without shame, to express her irritation without guilt, to admit her limitations without apology. This honesty about her full humanity paradoxically made her more trustworthy and approachable, rather than less lovable. Elena's creative expression blossomed as energy previously channeled into overfunctioning became available for authentic self-expression. Her painting evolved from tentative sketches to bold canvases that captured the emotional landscape of her transformation. Her writing progressed from scattered journal entries to coherent reflections on the journey, from compulsive giving to conscious loving. These creative outlets provided additional channels for processing and integrating her ongoing growth. The spiritual dimension of Elena's life deepened as she learned to extend the same unconditional love to herself that she had always believed was reserved for others. Her prayers shifted from requests for strength to serve others to gratitude for the opportunity to love authentically. Her meditation practice evolved from escape from difficult emotions to intimate friendship with her own inner experience. Elena's understanding of service was completely reconceptualized through her personal transformation. She discovered that the most profound way to help others was to model what it looked like to live with integrity, boundaries, and self-compassion. Her example gave others permission to honor their own needs, to set their own limits, to love themselves with the same tenderness they offered to those they cared about. The changes in Elena's way of being created concentric circles of transformation that extended far beyond her personal life, touching every relationship and community she was part of with the gentle but persistent influence of someone who had learned to love authentically. Her cottage became a subtle teaching environment where visitors unconsciously absorbed lessons about balanced living simply by witnessing Elena's peaceful relationship with her own needs and boundaries. Maria, whose husband's heart attack had provided the context for Elena's breakthrough, found herself inspired to examine her own patterns of emotional dependency and crisis management. Watching Elena offer practical support without emotional enmeshment had shown Maria a different model of friendship, one based on mutual respect rather than one-sided caregiving. She began developing her own emotional regulation skills and learned to ask for specific help rather than expecting others to intuitively know what she needed. Elena's massage therapy colleagues noticed a shift in her professional presence and began seeking her mentorship on maintaining boundaries while providing healing services. She started offering informal workshops on sustainable caregiving that attracted therapists, teachers, healthcare workers, and others whose professions required them to give emotionally while maintaining their own well-being. These gatherings became legendary in the Valley for their combination of practical wisdom and profound permission to include oneself in the circle of care. The Valley's weekly community meetings took on a different quality as Elena's presence demonstrated what it looked like to contribute without overfunctioning. Instead of automatically volunteering for every committee and task, she began choosing her involvement based on genuine interest and available capacity. This modeling gave others permission to participate selectively rather than feeling obligated to say yes to every request for help. Elena's family dynamics rippled outward as her siblings learned to communicate directly with each other rather than routing all interaction through Elena's mediation. Her mother, no longer able to rely on Elena to manage family conflicts, began developing her own skills for navigating relationship difficulties. Her brother's increased self-reliance led to better financial decisions and improved relationships with his own family members. The cottage that had once been a crisis center for the Valley transformed into a gathering place for people interested in personal growth and authentic living. Elena began hosting monthly potluck dinners where the conversation naturally turned to topics like boundary setting, self-compassion, and the difference between service and enablement. These informal gatherings attracted people from throughout the Valley who were hungry for models of healthy relationship dynamics. Elena's creative work became another vehicle for spreading the wisdom she had integrated. Her paintings displayed at the Valley's seasonal art shows captured the journey from depletion to wholeness in visual metaphors that spoke to others struggling with similar patterns. Her writing, published in the Valley newsletter, offered gentle guidance for anyone learning to balance generosity with self-care. The transformation in Elena's romantic life provided inspiration for others in the Valley who had struggled with codependent relationship patterns. When she eventually began dating again, her relationships were characterized by mutual support, clear communication, and respect for each other's autonomy. Her modeling of what it looked like to love someone without losing herself gave hope to people who had believed that intimacy required self-sacrifice. Local businesses began consulting Elena about creating healthier workplace cultures after witnessing the positive changes in her massage practice. She helped employers understand how supporting their workers' boundaries and well-being actually increased productivity and job satisfaction rather than enabling laziness or selfishness. Her insights about sustainable giving proved valuable in professional contexts where burnout had become epidemic. Elena's transformed relationship with receiving created permission for others in the valley to accept help gracefully rather than insisting on complete self-sufficiency. Her willingness to ask for support when needed and to accept others' offerings with genuine gratitude began to shift the community culture from one of isolated independence to healthy interdependence. The children in Elena's extended family and social circle absorbed lessons about self-worth and boundaries through their interactions with her. They learned that their value wasn't contingent on being helpful or pleasant, that their needs mattered as much as adults' needs, that they could offer kindness without sacrificing their own well-being. These children would grow up with a foundation of self-respect that would serve them throughout their lives. Elena's healing journey became a catalyst for others to examine their own patterns of overgiving, people-pleasing, and boundary violations. A transformation provided living proof that it was possible to maintain one's generous heart while learning to include oneself in the circle of compassion. People throughout the valley began their own processes of learning to receive love, set boundaries, and distinguish between authentic service and compulsive helping. The valley's seasonal festivals took on new characteristics as Elena's influence spread through the community. Instead of a few people doing most of the work while others participated passively, these events became truly collaborative efforts where everyone contributed according to their capacity and interests. The burden of organization was shared more equitably, creating celebrations that were more sustainable and more enjoyable for everyone involved. Elena's story became part of the valley's oral tradition, shared at gathering around fires and dinner tables as an example of how personal transformation could benefit entire communities. Her journey from compulsive helper to conscious giver provided hope for anyone struggling with patterns that no longer served them, demonstrating that change was possible at any stage of life. The meditation group that formed around Elena's kitchen table every Tuesday evening became a space where people practiced the radical act of paying attention to their own needs while remaining connected to others' well-being. These gatherings attracted people from neighboring valleys who had heard about the unique community that was developing around principles of balanced living and authentic love. As autumn returned to the valley, Elena could see the fruits of her transformation in the increased emotional health of her entire community. People were taking better care of themselves, asking for help when needed, offering support without depleting themselves, and creating relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. The ripple effects of her personal healing had created waves of positive change that would continue spreading long after she had learned to rest in the knowledge of her own worth. As winter settled over the valley like a contemplative silence, Elena found herself drawn into the deepest phase of her transformation, the integration of aspects of herself that she had spent decades denying, suppressing, or projecting onto others. The comfortable identity of the perpetual giver had served as a mask for parts of her psyche that felt too dangerous, too selfish, too human to acknowledge. But a journey toward wholeness now required embracing the full spectrum of her humanity. The process began with Elena's recognition of her own capacity for selfishness, not the cruel indifference that she had always feared, but the natural self-interest that every healthy organism possesses. She discovered that her compulsive giving had actually been a sophisticated form of selfishness, designed to meet her own needs for validation, control, and safety while appearing virtuous to others and herself. This recognition initially brought shame, but gradually evolved into compassion as Elena understood that even her most problematic patterns had been attempts to care for herself in the only way she had known how. Elena learned to acknowledge her anger, The rage she had carried for years at being taken for granted. The resentment that had accumulated from giving without receiving. The fury at having been trained to believe her needs didn't matter. Instead of judging these feelings as evidence of her failure to be properly loving, Elena began to honor them as important information about violations of her integrity and worth. Her anger became a guardian rather than an enemy, protecting her authentic self from further exploitation and abandonment. The jealousy Elena had felt watching others receive the care she gave so freely was another shadow aspect that demanded integration. She had spent years feeling guilty about envying friends whose partners surprised them with gifts, whose families remembered their birthdays, whose lives seemed to include the reciprocal love she craved. Learning to acknowledge this jealousy without shame allowed Elena to understand it as grief for what she had never received and longing for what she truly deserved. Elena's critical nature, which she had tried to suppress in service of being unconditionally accepting, revealed itself as discernment that had been forced underground. She discovered that her ability to see others' flaws and limitations was actually a gift when expressed with compassion rather than judgment. Her critical eye, when integrated with her loving heart, became wisdom that could help others grow rather than criticism that diminished their worth. The controlling aspects of Elena's personality, her need to manage outcomes, to prevent others' discomfort, to orchestrate situations for maximum harmony, were perhaps the most difficult shadow elements to embrace. She had identified so strongly as someone who went with the flow and accommodated others' preferences that recognizing her own manipulative tendencies felt like discovering she was an entirely different person. But Elena learned to see her controlling behavior as a distorted expression of her natural leadership abilities and her genuine desire to create beauty and harmony in the world. Elena's capacity for manipulation, which had been hidden beneath layers of helpfulness, became visible as she examined her historical patterns. She saw how her overgiving had often been a way of creating obligation in others, how her emotional availability had sometimes been used to gather information she could later use to maintain her indispensable status, how her rescue efforts had often enabled others' dysfunction in ways that kept them dependent on her support. Acknowledging these shadow motivations allowed Elena to clean up her giving, making it more authentic and less contaminated by hidden agendas. The laziness that Elena had been fighting her entire life through compulsive productivity revealed itself as her psyche's attempt to force rest and restoration. Her resistance to certain tasks and obligations wasn't moral failing but wisdom, her body's way of protecting her from further depletion and encouraging her to distinguish between necessary action and busy work, designed to avoid uncomfortable feelings or maintain her image as someone who never stopped helping. Elena's selfishness, anger, jealousy, criticism, control, manipulation, and laziness were all reframed as distorted expressions of healthy psychological functions, self-care, boundary setting, recognition of her own needs, discernment, leadership, influence, and restoration. Instead of trying to eliminate these aspects of herself, Elena learned to express them in ways that served her wholeness and contributed to her authentic relationships with others. The integration of her shadow allowed Elena to become more genuinely loving because her love was no longer contaminated by the energy required to suppress unwanted parts of herself. She could be present with others' full humanity because she had learned to be present with her own. Her compassion deepened because it now included the parts of herself she had previously judged as unacceptable, extending to others the same grace she had learned to offer herself. With the integration of her shadow aspects creating a foundation of authentic self-acceptance, Elena's journey turned toward the discovery of her deepest purpose, not the compulsive helping that had defined her for decades, but the genuine calling that emerged when she was no longer driven by unmet needs and unconscious patterns. This phase of her transformation felt like archaeology of the soul, excavating gifts and passions that have been buried beneath layers of accommodation and people-pleasing. Elena's true calling revealed itself gradually through her attention to what brought her alive independent of others' approval or gratitude. She noticed that her energy increased when she was creating beauty-arranging flowers from her garden, preparing meals that were as visually pleasing as they were nourishing, organizing her living space in ways that felt harmonious and peaceful. This aesthetic sensitivity had always been present, but had been channeled primarily into making others comfortable rather than expressing her own artistic vision. The massage therapy practice that had begun as a way to help others heal evolved into Elena's authentic expression of her gift for facilitating transformation through conscious touch. But now her work was informed by her own healing journey, her sessions becoming sacred containers where clients could experience the same journey from self-abandonment to self-love that Elena had traveled. Her touch carried the quality of someone who had learned to inhabit her own body with reverence, offering others permission to do the same. Elena discovered a profound calling to teach, not through formal instruction, but through the modeling of integrated living that inspired others to examine their own patterns and possibilities. The informal workshops she offered on sustainable caregiving grew into a recognized ministry of sorts, drawing people from throughout the region who were hungry for guidance on how to love authentically without losing themselves in the process of giving. Her writing evolved from personal journaling to offering wisdom that could serve others facing similar struggles with boundaries, self-worth, and the balance between generosity and self-care. Elena's words carried the authority of someone who had traveled the entire journey from compulsive helping to conscious service, providing roadmaps for others navigating similar terrain. Her articles began appearing in regional publications, reaching people far beyond the valley who needed to hear that transformation was possible. The creative expression that had been suppressed for decades in service of others' needs blossomed into Elena's recognition that beauty-making was not selfish indulgence, but essential service to a world starved for authentic inspiration. Her paintings captured the emotional landscapes of healing and growth. Her garden became a living artwork that demonstrated the principles of balanced giving and receiving. Her home became a sanctuary where others could experience what it felt like to be in the presence of someone who had learned to love herself. Elena's calling included advocacy for others who struggled with boundary issues, particularly women who had been socialized to believe their worth was contingent on their usefulness to others. She began speaking at conferences and workshops, sharing her story as evidence that the most profound service often required learning to include oneself in the circle of care. Her message resonated with healthcare workers, teachers, therapists, and anyone whose profession required them to give emotionally while maintaining their own well-being. The spiritual dimension of Elena's purpose emerged as she recognized her journey as part of a larger healing that was needed in the world, the restoration of balance between masculine and feminine energies, between doing and being, between service and self-care. She understood her personal transformation as contributing to collective healing. Her individual journey toward wholeness is part of humanity's evolution toward more sustainable and authentic ways of loving. Elena's soul alignment included a deep commitment to mentoring others through their own processes of learning to receive love, set boundaries, and distinguish between authentic generosity and compulsive accommodation. She discovered that her greatest gift was not solving others' problems, but holding space for their own wisdom to emerge, not rescuing them from their challenges, but supporting their capacity to navigate difficulties with grace and self-respect. The calling that emerged from Elena's soul alignment was simultaneously personal and universal, individual and collective, intimate and expansive. She was called to be herself fully with all her gifts, limitations, needs, and offerings, while supporting others in discovering their own authentic expression. Her purpose was to love consciously, give sustainably, receive gracefully, and model what it looked like to honor both individual needs and collective well-being. Elena's work in the world became an extension of her own healing, a service emerging organically from her wholeness rather than being driven by her wounds. She had discovered that the most profound contribution she could make was to live as an example of integrated humanity, demonstrating that it was possible to be deeply loving without self-sacrifice, profoundly generous without self-abandonment, authentically of service without losing oneself in the process of helping others. In the deepest winter of Elena's transformation, when the valley lay silent under blankets of snow and the world had contracted into its most contemplative season, she discovered the ultimate fruit of her journey, a connection to something far greater than her individual story, yet intimately present in every moment of her daily existence. This transcendent awareness arose not as escape from her humanity, but as the full flowering of her authentic self, integrated with the larger web of existence of which she had always been part. Elena's sense of universal belonging emerged through her recognition that her personal journey from compulsive giving to conscious loving was a microcosm of humanity's collective evolution toward more sustainable and authentic ways of relating. She understood that every boundary she had learned to set, every moment of self-compassion she had practiced, every act of receiving she had allowed, contributed to the healing of ancestral patterns that had been passed down through generations, of women who had been taught to find their worth through service to others. Standing in her snow-covered garden one evening, watching stars emerge in the clear winter sky, Elena experienced a profound knowing that her individual consciousness was both completely unique and entirely connected to the consciousness of every other being. The breath moving through her body was the same breath that sustained the sleeping trees. The awareness observing her thoughts was the same awareness that illuminated every mind. The love flowing through her heart was the same love that connected all beings across time and space. This transcendent perspective allowed Elena to see her entire life story, including the decades of overgiving and self-abandonment, as perfect in its imperfection, necessary for the wisdom and compassion she now embodied. She could feel gratitude even for her most painful experiences, understanding them as essential elements in the alchemical process that had transformed her from someone who loved fearfully into someone who loved freely. Elena's connection to timeless wisdom became a lived reality rather than an intellectual concept. She could access guidance that seemed to flow from beyond her personal knowledge, drawing from what felt like the accumulated wisdom of every person who had ever walked the path. From unconscious to conscious loving, her intuition became a reliable compass, informed by both her individual healing and her connection to universal truth about what it meant to live authentically. The compassionate presence that Elena had developed through embracing her own shadow and aligning with her soul's purpose expanded to include not just herself and those she served directly, but all beings everywhere who struggled with the balance between self-care and service to others. Her meditation practice evolved into a form of global healing work, where her own increasing wholeness contributed to the collective field of consciousness that influenced every human relationship. Elena's understanding of love transcended the personal and became cosmic, recognizing that the same force that held planets in their orbits and guided seasons in their cycles was the force that was healing her relationship with herself and others. Love was not something she gave or received, but something she was. Not something she had to earn, but something she embodied. Not something limited by individual relationships, but something that connected her to the entire universe. The peace that settled into Elena's being was not the temporary calm that comes from having solved all problems, but the profound stillness that arises from alignment with what is eternal and unchanging beneath all the surface changes of life. She could rest in this peace regardless of external circumstances, knowing that her essential self was always safe, always loved, always connected to the source of all well-being. Elena's daily life became a continuous prayer of gratitude and service. Each interaction an opportunity to offer the love she had learned to receive. Each boundary a gift to the collective healing of humanity's relationship with authentic care. She moved through her days with the awareness that her personal healing was inseparable from the healing of the world, that her individual wholeness contributed to universal wholeness. As Elena prepared each night for sleep, she would place her hand on her heart and feel her connection to every person who had ever struggled with the balance between giving and receiving, sending love to anyone who was learning to include themselves in their own circle of compassion. Her dreams became spaces of continued healing and service, where her consciousness could offer support to others navigating similar journeys toward authentic love. The transcendent connection Elena had discovered was not a destination but a way of being, not an achievement but a recognition of what had always been true, that love, when freed from the distortions of fear and need, revealed itself as the fundamental fabric of existence, connecting every being in an eternal dance of giving and receiving that included everyone and excluded no one. As spring returned once again to the valley, Elena stood in her garden watching the first crocuses push through the earth with the same gentle persistence she had learned to apply to her own growth. 3 years had passed since that first morning when her body had refused to accommodate another person's crisis. 3 years since she had begun the journey from compulsive giving to conscious loving, from self-abandonment to authentic service. The cottage around her bore witness to a life transformed, not through dramatic overhaul, but through countless small choices to include herself in her own circle of compassion. The massage practice that had once depleted her now filled her with purpose and energy. The relationships that had survived her boundary setting had evolved into connections, based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The creative expressions that had been suppressed for decades now flowed freely, contributing beauty and inspiration to a world hungry for authentic offerings. Elena's days had found their natural rhythm, flowing between solitude and connection, service and rest, giving and receiving in the balanced dance that healthy living required. She no longer needed to force boundaries or struggle to maintain her sense of self in relationship with others. The integration of her shadow, the alignment with her soul's purpose, and her connection to transcendent love had created a foundation of wholeness that could weather any storm, while remaining open to life's infinite possibilities. The valley community had grown and evolved as well, influenced by Elena's modeling of what it looked like to love authentically without losing oneself in the process. The weekly gatherings in her cottage had become a recognized source of wisdom for anyone learning to balance generosity with self-care. Her informal teaching had reached people throughout the region who were hungry for guidance on sustainable love and conscious service. Standing among the awakening flowers, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from a life of anxious accommodation to this moment of peaceful authenticity. Every challenge had been necessary. Every difficult emotion had carried important information. Every boundary she had learned to set had created space for more genuine connection. The woman who had once believed her worth was contingent on her usefulness now knew herself as valuable simply for existing, worthy of love, not because of what she could provide, but because of who she was. The transformation was complete, not because Elena had reached some final destination, but because she had learned to trust the ongoing process of growth, to remain curious about her evolving understanding of love and service, to stay open to the continuous refinement of her capacity for authentic relationship. She had discovered that healing was not a project to be finished, but a way of being to be practiced, not a destination to arrive at, but a path to walk with increasing skill and grace. As evening light painted the valley in shades of gold and rose, Elena felt profound gratitude for the courage she had found to change, for the support she had received along the way, for the privilege of modeling a different way of being for others who might need permission to include themselves in their own love. Her story had become a living testament to the possibility of transformation, proof that the most entrenched patterns could evolve when met with patience, compassion, and unwavering commitment to wholeness. And now, as Elena's story settles into the quieter chambers of your consciousness, allow yourself to feel the resonance between her journey and your own. Perhaps you recognize the familiar weight of always putting others first, the exhaustion that comes from giving without receiving, the longing for relationships where love flows freely in all directions. Ellen's transformation is not just her story, but a mirror reflecting the possibility that lives within your own heart. Notice how your body responds to the idea that your needs matter as much as anyone else's, that your boundaries are not barriers to love, but pathways to more authentic connection. Feel the truth in your bones that sustainable kindness begins with kindness toward yourself, that the most profound service often requires learning to receive the care you offer so freely to others. Elena's journey from compulsive helping to conscious loving is available to you as well, not as another project to complete, but as a gentle invitation to include yourself in your own circle of compassion. The courage she found to say, "That doesn't work for me," lives within you too, waiting to be activated when you're ready to honor your own wisdom, alongside your generous heart. As your breathing naturally deepens and your muscles begin to release the day's accumulated tensions, allow Elena's story to plant seeds in the fertile soil of your subconscious mind. Let her transformation remind your cells that balance is possible, that love can include the lover, that service can be sustainable when it flows from wholeness rather than depletion. Your nervous system is already beginning to recalibrate toward the peace Elena discovered, your psyche already opening to receive the permissions she learned to give herself, the wisdom she embodied, that authentic love requires authentic boundaries, that sustainable giving requires graceful receiving, is absorbing into your awareness like nutrients feeding growing roots. Tonight, as sleep approaches with its gift of restoration and renewal, you carry within you the same capacity for transformation that guided Elena from exhaustion to vitality, from self-abandonment to self-love, from anxious accommodation to peaceful authenticity. Her story has become part of your story, her healing contributing to your own unfolding journey toward wholeness. As consciousness gently releases its hold on the events of the day, your body naturally settles into the profound rest that comes from recognizing your own worth, your own right to care and consideration and love. Like Elena sinking into her bed after that first day of honoring her own needs, you can feel the deep satisfaction that comes from including yourself in your own compassion. Your muscles are learning Elena's lesson about sustainable service as they release tension and find comfort in the support beneath you. Your nervous system is remembering the peace she discovered as it shifts from hypervigilance to the natural rhythm of restoration. Your heart is opening to receive the love you have always given so freely, allowing yourself to rest in the knowledge of your own inherent worth. Each breath carries away the weight of old patterns that no longer serve. Each exhale releasing the belief that your value depends on your availability to others. Your lungs are learning Elena's rhythm of natural giving and receiving, drawing in the nourishment of rest and releasing the day's accumulated responsibilities. Your mind is finding the stillness Elena discovered in her transformed cottage. Thoughts naturally quieting as you settle into the sanctuary of your own being. The stories and worries that seemed so urgent just moments ago are fading like mist in morning sunlight, replaced by the profound peace that comes from knowing you are worthy of rest, worthy of care, worthy of love that asks nothing in return. Sleep approaches now like the gentle spring rain that nourished Elena's garden, bringing renewal and restoration to every part of your being. Your consciousness is ready to rest in the knowledge that love, when it includes the lover, creates infinite abundance. Tonight, you sleep in the peace of knowing that your generous heart can learn to include yourself, that your capacity for love expands when it encompasses your own precious existence. Rest now in the sanctuary of your own worthiness and the knowledge that love, when freely given and gracefully received, creates the very healing the world needs most.